My greedy stepmother is demanding that I give up my late mother's house because my father told her I would at 31. I have a stepmother whom my father married just a year after my mother passed away. I felt uncomfortable watching my father fall in love with another woman so quickly. I didn't think much of it until my father, and I discovered that my mother hadn't left anything to him in her will. Instead, all her assets, including the beach house, were left to me. My mother left me a letter, and when I finally read it, I found out things I wish I had never known. My mother, who was sick at the time, had discovered that my father was having an affair with another woman. She told me she had suspected it for a long time, ever since she was diagnosed with cancer. Since then, my father had become distant. She said he constantly asked about her will and kept reminding her that he would take care of the beach house when she passed. My mother was devastated and spent her final days with a man who had been unfaithful to her. When I read that letter, I couldn't help but cry uncontrollably in my room. I wished I had been there for my mother. The more I cried, the more I felt anger and hatred toward my father and stepmother. When my father found out that nothing had been left to him, he lost his patience and began shouting, asking why he hadn't been left anything. It was clear to me that all my father cared about were my mother's possessions, not her. So, I decided to leave my hometown and cut ties with my father and his lover. I moved into my mother's beach house, where I planned to start fresh. I've always worked from home, so relocating was never a problem. It wasn't until recently that I received a text from my stepmother. She asked how I was doing, but I didn't respond. She texted again, more directly this time, saying I needed to move out of the beach house because she and my father were moving in. But if I wanted to stay, I could pay them rent for my room. I was speechless when I read the message, unsure if she was lying or serious. I told her the house was in my name, and that I would call the police if they set foot on my property. She never replied after that. I thought that was the end of it, but a couple of weeks later, I received a notification on my phone while I was out shopping. There had been movement near my front door. I opened the app and saw my stepmother and father getting out of their car and unloading their belongings. My heart sank, and I immediately felt a surge of anger. I called the police right away and told them people were trespassing on my property. By the time I arrived, the police were already there. After the restraining order and their defeat in court, I thought I could finally have peace. The beach house had become my sanctuary, a place where each sunset over the ocean made me feel more connected to my mother and further away from my father's lies and betrayal. However, even though they lost the legal battle, the emotional war had only just begun. My stepmother, always crafty and determined to get what she wanted, wasn't going to give up so easily. A couple of weeks after the court ruling, I started noticing something strange during my morning walks on the beach. I felt like I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just paranoia after everything that had happened, but soon it became clear it wasn't just my imagination. I saw a car parked near the entrance of the property, always the same car, but I could never see who was inside. I knew my father and stepmother were behind it. They were trying to intimidate me, to make me feel unsafe in my own home. I decided to install more security cameras around the house and at the entrances to the property. I needed proof that they were still harassing me. Not long after, my suspicions were confirmed. In one of the night recordings, I saw a man, clearly a thug they had hired, lurking near the entrance, checking windows, and trying to get into the house. There was no doubt they were planning something bigger, maybe looking for something valuable they could use against me. I called the police again, but their response was slow and ineffective. Even though the footage was clear, the officers told me there wasn't enough to make any arrests, just warnings. I felt like the justice system, which had once seemed to be on my side, was now leaving me defenseless against my father and stepmother's manipulative attempts. And his wife. A few days later, as I was returning from a brief trip to the city, I found the beach house with the lights off, as if the electricity had been cut. Upon entering, I felt the tension in the air. Everything seemed in order, but I noticed something was out of place. A window in the back was slightly open. Panic consumed me. My personal space had been violated. I rushed to check every corner of the house, searching for signs of intrusion, but I found nothing. I checked the cameras, and although there were no clear images of anyone entering, I was convinced someone had been there. The feeling of insecurity grew inside me. They were playing with me, creating an atmosphere of fear and control, constantly reminding me I wasn't safe. That's when I decided to fight back. If they wanted a war, I wasn't going to remain the victim. I hired a private investigator to keep an eye on my father and his wife. I wanted to know every step they took, every suspicious move. What he discovered left me speechless. It turns out my father and his wife were in serious financial trouble. Debt was suffocating them, and in their minds the beach house was their ticket out. They were desperate, which is why they tried to pressure me in every way possible to get me to cave. But what shocked me the most was that my father had mortgaged the house they lived in with my mother, without telling her anything. And when she passed away, all that debt fell on him. They were more sunk than I had imagined, and their only way out was to recover something of value, the beach house. With this information in hand, I began to make decisions. First, I reinforced security measures at the house and hired a private security team to watch the property 24/7. I knew I couldn't underestimate them. But I also made sure to protect myself legally. I decided to expose them by bringing the information to the authorities and filing a new lawsuit against them for attempted fraud and harassment. As the legal battle moved forward, I began receiving more text messages from unknown numbers, clearly from my father and his wife. They were desperate messages, first asking me to reconsider, then threatening me with more lawsuits. What they didn't know was that I wasn't afraid anymore. Now I was the one controlling the game. The culmination of it all came when my father and his wife were foreclosed. Their assets were seized, and the house they so coveted ended up being sold to cover the debts they had accumulated. I watched them lose everything from a distance, without the slightest drop of remorse. I knew they would never have shown me mercy if they had gotten what they wanted. Finally, it was over. My father and his wife moved to a distant city, with no money, no property, and most importantly, no power over me. I kept the beach house, with the peace of knowing I had defended my mother's legacy and the satisfaction of having defeated those who tried to destroy me. Every sunset from the terrace of the beach house brings me a deep sense of peace. It's as if the ocean whispers the forgiveness I never received from my mother but somehow found within myself. My father had disappeared from my life, and although the scars of betrayal remain, what they couldn't take from me was my freedom and the memory of the one who truly loved me. Now, when I walk along the beach, I no longer feel fear, only a future, clean and free from the shadows of the past. After the legal process, and the seizure of my father and his wife's assets, I thought I could finally move on with my life, free from the constant shadow of their greed and manipulation. The beach house became my ultimate refuge, a sanctuary where I could rebuild myself and heal the deep wounds their betrayals had left. However, although I won the legal battle, their resentment towards me never disappeared. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Over time, I started hearing rumors. Some family friends, people who had known both my mother and my father for years, told me that my father and stepmother wouldn't stop slandering me. They called me ungrateful, claimed I had left them ruined out of spite, and that I had betrayed them after all they had done for me. The irony of those words was as bitter as the poison they spread. The story they told anyone who would listen was that I had unfairly snatched the beach house, that my mother had been confused in her final days, and that I had manipulated her into leaving everything to me. They invented that my father had been a devoted husband, painting a picture of him as the victim of an ambitious son who took advantage of his dying mother. Sometimes, even my own father, who had sunk so low, would try to contact me, sending messages blaming me for their misfortune, telling me that I owed them something, that everything that had happened to them was my fault. At first, those words affected me more than I wanted to admit. Every time I heard a new slander, every time I received a guilt-laden message, I felt trapped between rage and sadness. Wanted to confront them, to scream at them that they had caused their own downfall. That if they were at the bottom of the pit, it wasn't because of what I had done, but because of their own selfish and greedy actions. But I knew it wasn't worth it. I watched from a distance as my father and his wife had been reduced to nothing. They were barely surviving, living in a small rented house far away from everything they once had. They had no friends, no family support. The same social circle they once belonged to, the prestigious community they valued so much, had now rejected them. My stepmother's lies and manipulations were well known, and many of the people who used to surround them had come to see them for who they truly were. But despite their lives completely falling apart, they still clung to a narrative where I was the villain. They wanted to blame me for everything because they couldn't face the reality of their own failures. They had become what I could only describe as ghosts from the past, lurking in the shadows of what once was, waiting for a redemption that would never come. However, instead of falling into their trap of confrontation, I chose to do something wiser. I stepped away completely. I stopped responding to their messages. I didn't argue with those repeating their lies, and I refused to let their resentment poison my peace any longer. I knew that the only path to true freedom was to completely let go of that toxic past. I began focusing on my own life. The beach house that initially felt like an emotional burden became my starting point for something new. I invested in improving it, modernizing the classic home my mother loved while adding personal touches that made it more mine. It became a place where I could invite close friends, work in peace, and enjoy nature, free from the emotional chains my family had placed on me. Over time, I met someone. It was unexpected, as these things often are, but the connection was instant. They didn't know about my past or the complications with my family, which was refreshing. I could start over, free from the shadows of what had happened. Little by little, I built a new and fuller life, far away from the chaos of the past. My relationships became more authentic, and I surrounded myself with people who truly appreciated me for who I was, not for what they could get from me. Meanwhile, my father and his wife continued their downward spiral. I would occasionally hear that their situation kept getting worse. No financial stability, no support, and with their reputation completely ruined, they had become outcasts. My stepmother, who had always been the most insistent with her lies, suffered the worst. At one point, she even tried reaching out to distant family members to convince them to help, but no one believed her manipulations anymore. She had dug her own grave and was finally paying for her crimes, not just with me, but with everyone she had once deceived. My father, on the other hand, was more like a ghost of his former self. He had lost all his status, his money, and most importantly, any respect he once had. I heard rumors that his health was declining, and although a part of me, the part of a wounded child who once loved him, felt pity, I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't give him what he wanted, either emotionally nor in any other way. They still tried to paint me as the villain, but it didn't matter anymore. Their words held no power over me. They had lost, not just the legal battle, but something much bigger. They had lost their dignity, their humanity. And that wasn't because of me, but because of their own greed and selfishness. I moved on, thriving in my new life, letting time do its work. Justice had already been served, not just in the courts, but in life itself. And though I would never get an apology or acknowledgement from them, I no longer needed it. Every time I walk along the beach at sunset, I feel the peace of someone who has overcome their past. My mother would be proud, not because I won a war, but because I chose peace. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't watching them fall, it was learning to live without them, free, whole, and at peace.